Hello, this webcast deals with discrimination after the Civil War and the situation of African Americans in that time period beginning in 1877 at the end of Reconstruction and running through the turn of the century, arguably up to the beginning of World War I. We we're going to look at the overall restrictions on African Americans and what came to be known as Jim Crow laws. This was in the period after Reconstruction had ended, and what we found was the South reimposing essentially their form of slavery without slavery. This took the form of all kinds of laws that came to be known as Jim Crow laws or segregation laws, laws which forced African Americans into separate eating facilities, separate waiting rooms, as you see in this picture, or even separate. In this picture we see an African American going up to go to a separate section in a movie theater. There were the separate drinking fountains, which we've seen pictures of, or the buses and so forth. Jim Crow was a brutal system of segregation, which ultimately would be affirmed by the Supreme Court in a case known as Plessy v. Ferguson. Here the situation was a young man, maybe not so young, by the name of Homer Plessy, who had a first-class train ticket. He got onto the train, went to the first-class car. Homer Plessy was a light-skinned black man, and he got into the car, first-class compartment, first-class ticket, goes to sit down because there is no so-called colored section of the car. He goes to what is a whites-only section. The police are summoned. The police unceremoniously grab Homer Plessy and toss him off the train, saying, "No, sorry, you are colored." That's the term they would have used at the time. "You are colored and you cannot sit in the whites-only section." Homer Plessy, like any good American, sues. It goes to the Supreme Court. He argues there was no first-class accommodation in the colored section. The colored section was more like third or maybe even fifth class. The Supreme Court ends up deciding against Homer Plessy, in essence saying that there are no laws that the Supreme Court needs to direct specifically for African Americans. I don't know if I phrased that very clearly, but in essence the Supreme Court is upholding what comes to be known as the separate but equal doctrine, the idea that as long as there are separate facilities, then they are equal. This is then applied to schools, and as I said, movie theaters and eating establishments and so forth and so on. In part as a result of these laws, which as we said came to be known as Jim Crow laws, we see a massive migration of individuals from the Deep South up to the North. We call this the Great Migration. Here it's portrayed in a photograph, a painting rather, by Jacob Lawrence. And here in a map you see the Great Migration represented mostly folks coming from the places where African Americans had lived during slavery and before the Civil War. Now later, by the turn of the century and moving into the 1900s, we're going to start to see challenges to some of these Jim Crow laws. For example, this photograph is actually taken in the 1950s, I believe, and it represents the beginning of the African American response to the Jim Crow era. There were others during that time period who challenged the Jim Crow laws, including perhaps most notably people like Webb Du Bois and Booker T. Washington, as well as Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell led a crusade against lynching. Lynching was quite common during this time period. Around the turn of the century, Theodore Roosevelt was the first president to ever invite an African American to the White House. He invited Booker T. Washington. Here you see it portrayed in a cartoon with Lincoln in the background. Theodore Roosevelt actually took a huge amount of flack, I guess you'd say, from his Southern supporters, because the idea of an African American eating dinner at the White House was completely unthinkable, which of course is ironic because these days an African American has dinner at the White House, well, pretty much every night, since the president is African American. Now, Booker T. Washington and Webb Du Bois, here you see Booker T. Washington pictured on the left, Webb Du Bois on the right. These two individuals had very, very different visions for how to achieve equality. Booker T. Washington supported a vocational form of education, meaning work will lead to equality. So he believed in learning a skill, working at that skill, and living in essentially separately from whites. So he wasn't demanding immediate equality. He believed in work will eventually lead to equality. He, at the Atlantic Convention, described whites and blacks as living like separate fingers on the same hand, or different hands, I guess, but separate fingers that could be grasped together but could still exist separately. Now on the right, we see Webb Du Bois, who presented a very, very different vision. His vision was one of immediate equality. He talked about what we refer to as the talented tenth, that is, educating African Americans, and that talented tenth would raise them up. He founded the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, whose main role ultimately would be in the courts. And it was NAACP lawyers who ultimately would challenge the Plessy case in what came to be known as Brown v. Board of Education, and arguably begins the modern civil rights movement. Here I want to show you a quick section from a film, if I can pull it up, titled The Rise and Fall of Jim Crow.
Boys, I'm just from Tuckahoe. I'm trying to sing a little song. My name's Jim Crow. Wheel about, turn about, and do just so. Every time I wheel about, I jump Jim Crow. I went down to the river.
In 1836, Jim Crow he begins his strange career as a malicious caricature created by a white man to amuse white audiences. Jim Crow would come to symbolize one of the most tragic eras of race relations in American history, a time deeply rooted in promise and contradiction. 1865, 4 million Americans, slaves simply because they were born black, were now free. But in a little over a decade, that promise was gone. Replaced by a rigid system of laws designed to keep blacks from experiencing any of their newly achieved rights. It would be known as the era of Jim Crow, the American form of racial apartheid.
I tried to leave inside and get me a cup of water. And those white people beat me till I was unconscious. They thought I was dead.
My dad said, as long as you living in this South, you're going to have to go to the back door in this town. And you just settle for that. He said, the one thing I want you to swear, I promise you will never get used to it.
I'm not ashamed of the segregated and the Jim Crow experience. All because we were able to devise techniques for survival that permitted us to abide our time and to wait until our change.
As most blacks were willing to buy their time, some began to fight back. In the late 1880s and 90s, they embarked on an uncertain campaign to secure voting rights, build their own communities, schools, businesses, and churches, and to demand redress against mob violence and lynching. The white supremacists fought back. In 1919, the Ku Klux Klan, which had been a Southern idiosyncrasy, became a national ideology. White supremacy, the power behind Jim Crow, appeared invincible. And over the next decade, the violence against blacks would grow even more horrific. But black Americans continue to battle, using the power of the press, ultimately the power of the courts, to pursue their quest for freedom and equality that gives prison. The rise and fall of Jim Crow is their story.
So this is Webb Du Bois, and the individual right here is that's Booker T. Washington. The picture before was a photograph of Thurgood Marshall, who was the person who led the Brown v. Board of Education case.
Is their story. The story of strong men and women who never,
that's Ida Tarbell.
Accepted the meaning, threatening, and careless world of Jim Crow.
These are one of the members of the Little Rock Nine, who we'll talk about when we get to Standard 14 in the Civil Rights Movement.
The rise and fall of Jim Crow. The story of those who in the state.
And this is the newspaper on the day of the Brown v. Board of Education case in 1953.
Face of unending terror. Achieved triumph.
And that's a photograph of the March on Washington in 1963.
Triumphs that would in time make America a better place. Not just for themselves, but for all of us.
And that pretty much covers our sense of today's web quest, which was, right, if we recall, today we're focusing on discrimination after the Civil War. Thank you.